In 1986, writer Brian Helgeland and his wife were driving to Las Vegas for a friend's wedding. It was night, and they were driving through a dark, deserted road when from out of nowhere, a police cruiser drove up behind them, lights blazing, and pulled them over. The cop shined his light in their faces and walked around their car a few times. Then, without saying a word, he got in his car and drove off. Helgeland turned to his wife and said, "That was a cop out of hell." Shortly thereafter, this inspired Helgeland to start writing a script about a cop from hell. The script he wrote was about a couple on their way to Las Vegas to get married. Along the way, the bride-to-be is kidnapped by the hell cop, who delivers the woman to his master, Satan. The groom-to-be then goes on a bizarre journey to hell to get her back. Helgeland wrote the script as a cross between Orpheus, the Wizard of Oz, and the Road Warrior. It was intentionally weird, littered with references to the Seventh Seal and the Divine Comedy. He called it the name that fit it best, Highway to Hell. A few years later, Helgeland broke into the industry, writing the script for A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and 976 Evil. Helgeland had been trying to sell the script for Highway to Hell, but wasn't having much luck. It was optioned by numerous studios, who all ended up passing on it. It was first picked up by Alex De Benedetti, the producer of Pumpkinhead. Then it went to New Line Cinema, who thought it would be perfect for special effects master Rob Bottin to direct. Then to Lorimar with Stuart Gordon directing. Stephen Herrick, the director of Critters, and Tommy Lee Wallace, the director of Halloween 3, were also interested, but nothing came of it. Around the time when Highway to Hell was doing the rounds, another script called Route 666 was circulating, which had a very similar scenario. A group of people get trapped on a stretch of road that is more or less a portal to hell. There was a rumor that Helgeland was working with another writer on Highway to Hell who left over creative differences to write Route 666. But Helgeland said it was just a case of two people coming up with the same idea at the same time. After all this, the script caught the attention of John Byers, the vice president of production at United Artists. United Artists bought the script for Highway to Hell, and Byers, along with producer Marianne Page, worked with Helgeland on developing the script. Sometime after this, United Artists was having financial problems, and the studio went bankrupt. As part of a severance deal, United Artists gave the rights for Highway to Hell to John Byers and Marianne Page. Around this time, the studio Hemdale was growing. They had two major hits with The Terminator and Platoon. Despite this, they hadn't had a hit in a while and were looking for a new hip film to break them out of their rut. The producers brought it to Hemdale, who loved it, except for the price tag. The film was looking to cost around $20 million to make, and that was more than double what they were willing to spend. So they went back to Helgeland to try to scale the film down to be in the $8 to $9 million range. Despite the confines of the smaller budget, Helgeland thought this greatly improved the script because it helped to focus more on the characters than just the setting. The producers were looking for a director, and all agreed on hiring Dutch filmmaker Ate de Jong. De Jong had recently directed the World War II film Shadow of Victory, which was receiving a lot of positive press. He also directed an episode of Miami Vice, which was one of the hottest shows on TV at the time. De Jong was excited because he grew up with American films and was overjoyed to be able to go to Hollywood to make one. They hired stop-motion expert Randy Cook to work on some of the mechanical effects. He called visual effects designer Steve Johnson, who was just working on the TV series Monsters. Cook asked if he'd be interested in handling the special makeup effects and some of the practicals. He told him they had this great director who did this amazing World War II film. Intrigued, Johnson watched the film, and it was indeed amazing. He was hired for the effects, which would end up being a lot more than he initially thought. Johnson had just finished his work on The Abyss, where he had no control. One of the things that was refreshing about working on Highway to Hell was that they gave him complete freedom. They showed him their ideas, and it was up to him to make them happen or to make them better. When Johnson was told about Hell Cop, the original design concept he was presented was a cop that was half lizard and half zombie. Johnson scoffed because they were two of the most overused images out there. He wanted to come up with a better design, making the character covered in burn scars. Although he had to be careful. With a face that was burned and scarred, how do you do that without it looking like Freddy Krueger? At the time, he was reading Clive Barker's Books of Blood, where a character is having stories carved into his skin. He took this idea and infused it into the design of Hell Cop. His scars weren't scars at all, but biblical epitaphs carved into his skin. Johnson needed something to do for Hell Cop's eyes. He didn't want to do contact lenses. He already had some in mind for the devil. So one day he passed by a sunglasses store, and they had glasses with an orange tint. He He thought, "This was perfect! No one's ever seen something like this!" When Johnson was designing the Hellcop mask, the director went to the shop to pay him a visit. While there, a person came out and asked if he knew who he was. The director gave him a good look and said he had no idea. He then went inside and asked Johnson, who said, "Oh, that's Michael Jackson." Jackson hired Johnson to make him a new mask every 6 weeks so he could go out in public without being bothered. The film had numerous sight gags, one of which was Hellcop's handcuffs. They had a few different ones, but the main ones were a fully animatronic set that could be puppeted around. They were very expensive. Casting turned into an unexpected problem. The producers said that in the late 80s there was this weird born-again trend in Hollywood. As such, there were certain actors they went after who flat out refused to even read the script because it had the word hell in the title. Many thought it was going to be yet another slasher film, even though they tried time and time again to explain that it wasn't. Finally, after a longer period than normal, they were able to get their cast. For the main cast, they hired Chad Lowe as Charlie, Christy Swanson as Rachel, Pamela Gidley as Clara, Adam Stork as Royce, and Patrick Bergen as Beazle. For the role of the Hellcop, they needed a large, imposing figure. They hired C.J. Graham, who recently played Jason in Friday the 13th Part 6. Graham was actually their second choice. The first, they discovered, had an allergic reaction to the prosthetics, so he couldn't do the part. They then called Graham, who was able to do it. They initially wanted to have a bunch of well-known comedians doing cameos. They had spots in the script specifically to be filled by whoever they could get. Unfortunately, with the budget they had, they couldn't afford as many as they wanted, so they were only able to hire a few. One of them was legendary comedian Gilbert Gottfried. They worked out a deal with comedians Jerry Stiller and his wife Ann Mira. They hired them as a package deal as long as their kids could be in the movie, their daughter Amy, and their struggling comedian son Ben. They had a few other non-comedian cameos like Lita Ford. The British rock band Das Psycho Rangers were the members of Royce's gang. Since they were aiming for a PG-13 rating, they made hell more surrealistic instead of what you would normally think of as hell. This allowed them plenty of room to get creative. When scouting locations, they figured the best place to be able to do hell on a budget were the deserts of Arizona. They also planned to shoot a little in Utah. The director wanted the locations to be free of any kind of life. They wanted no green in hell. Most of the places they had were barren, but the only place where they were able to build the diner was surrounded by shrubs. They were mostly brown and dying, so they decided it was okay. They didn't have it in the budget to dig them all up. The exterior was a facade, and the interior was a set in a different location. Things were gonna be tight. Hemdale was having money problems, and the budget was set at somewhere between $6 and $8 million. They started filming in October of 1989. The first day of filming, a fluke dust storm ravaged the diner set. It was blowing the set over, and Johnson was screaming to his crew to find the handcuffs. "Grab the handcuffs! They're worth $75,000! They managed to save the cuffs, but the team had to rebuild the diner set. Throughout filming, at least one other dust storm destroyed the set. The restaurant they found for the opening of the film was perfect, except for one thing. All year round, it was decorated like Christmas. They didn't want the audience to perceive that this was a Christmas movie, so they redecorated the location for the shoot. The gas station was a house that they added pillars and pumps to make it look like a gas station. Lita Ford was happy to show off her cleavage. The producer, Marianne Page, hated it though. She thought that all the murder and whatnot was fine, but having sexual innuendo was wrong. The director reminded her that this was, in fact, hell, and there had to be temptation. So she let them keep it in the movie under protest. The diner scene with all the cops was a nightmare. Johnson said he was on a controlled substance, which gave him the energy to stay up all night to make sure the makeup was right. They had numerous extras, each with a different gag, like this guy with handcuffs through his eyes. One day they were filming an exterior. There was this young kid who was supposed to be the cook for the diner, and he was outside ad-libbing his lines. Johnson read the script, so he knew this kid was ad-libbing. He was talking to some of the other guys about how this kid was supposed to be a comedian, but every line he threw out was awful and unfunny. Out of everyone here, this guy was going nowhere. That kid, of course, was Ben Stiller. The director, on the other hand, thought he was hilarious. Ben ended up playing two parts, the cook and Attila the Hun. His sister Amy played Cleopatra. For the demon woman disguised as Rachel, they had an actor who was very skinny, and they built the costume around his physique. That was Michael McKay, who wore the mummy costume in the Monster Squad. Johnson joked that to him, it looked like Ernest Borgnine. McKay had to wear the suit 2 days in a row, 20 hours at a time. The hands and feet went on and off easily, but the rest of the costume had to stay on for the duration. Randy Cook handled the stop-motion animation on Cerebus, the three-headed dog. He was supposed to do a stop-motion transformation between Christy Swanson and the guy in the demon suit, but that was cut either for time or budget reasons. Now it's done as a cross-dissolve. The massive 7-foot 2.5-inch tall Kevin Peter Hall played the small role of Sharon, the gatekeeper to hell. He's known as the man in the costume for Predator 1 and 2, as well as the short-lived TV series Misfits of Science. Patrick Bergen's contact lenses kept moving, so at times, the devil was cross-eyed. They had to stop filming every time to fix it so the devil didn't look silly. The Hellcop mask took 2.5 hours to apply. Initially, Hellcop had a very small part in the film. As the dailies came in, they saw how well he played on screen and decided he was the hook that would get people to see the movie. They then tried to incorporate him more into the film without completely rewriting the script. They mostly just added him into scenes where he previously wasn't. They ran into something they weren't expecting. After long stretches of wearing the mask, Graham developed claustrophobia. They said it was really odd seeing this gigantic guy freaking out. So they rescheduled it, that he would only have the mask on for a few hours at a time. Spirits were high while working on the film, and there were talks about bringing Hellcop back in a Highway to Hell sequel. That is, if the movie did well enough at the box office to allow it. They had 2 Hellcop cars, one for driving and another for stunts. They were worried about destroying the stunt car, so they saved it for the big jump at the end. They did the stunt, and much like they suspected, it destroyed the car. Thankfully, they got their shots and didn't need it anymore. The film is full of references and jokes. The joke with the diner was that it was the only place the police were allowed to go in hell, and they could never get their coffee and donuts. This is a reference to Sisyphus and Dainades, women who pour water into a jar, and when someone picks it up, water runs out. The Table of Dictators. They had another reserve table for more dictators with a special spot for Jerry Lewis, with his placard written in French. There was the joke of Hitler being played by Jewish comedian Gilbert Gottfried. They had workers constantly paving the road to hell with good intentions.
I was only sleeping with my husband's boss to advance his career.
There were groups of Andy Warhols that looked like road cleaners, but really, they were constantly making a mess, dumping Campbell's soup cans everywhere. All the cars driving through hell were Volkswagen Beetles. The highway to hell was a 13-lane highway. The river Styx, the apple from the Garden of Eden, and plenty of others. The biggest mythological reference was a segment from the Orpheus, where Orpheus goes to hell to save his lost wife. After 7 weeks, they stopped filming. The director worked on the edit and oversaw some of the optical effects. While the film was in post-production, de Jong flew back to Holland to be with his wife for the birth of their child. When he returned, he discovered his film had been re-edited. John Daly at Hemdale had a penchant for re-editing films without the director's knowledge or consent. He'd wait for the editor to leave, and then would edit the film at night when no one was around, making changes that only he wanted. He messed with James Cameron on The Terminator, and even tried with Oliver Stone's Platoon. Stone wasn't having it though, and every night when he left, he took the footage with him so the producer couldn't mess with it. Daly made quick cuts in the film, which ruined a lot of the tension and removed much of the character development. It got so bad, de Jong was asking to have his name removed from the film altogether. The biggest disagreement was the ending. After the big fight at the end, there was originally a resolution scene where Charlie and Rachel separate at the airport. They decided instead of getting married, they're going to follow their individual dreams for a while. If they come back, they are really in love and should get married. Daly thought it was too much of a down ending and wanted to have a happy ending. Finally, after a lot of arguing, they met in the middle. Neither was particularly happy, but they needed to agree in order to get the film finished. The ending resolution was now told through text, which de Jong was allowed to write. Daly fought to have the text placed after all the credits. De Jong argued that no one would see it that way. This was a long time before stingers at the end of credits was a thing. He He fought to have the text placed at the end of the film before the credits, where it should be, and the producer gave in. They were hoping to have the film out for the summer of 1990. Then something the director suspected was going to happen did happen. Hemdale went bankrupt. The film was finished, but it was put on the shelf while the studio went through bankruptcy proceedings. In the meantime, de Jong was hired to shoot another film, Drop Dead Fred. Drop Dead Fred was released on May 24th, 1991 in the US, but due to Hemdale's bankruptcy, Highway to Hell still was sitting on a shelf. The film was in limbo so long, another movie called Highway to Hell was released. After about 2 years, the film was finally released. Highway to Hell hit theaters in the US on March 13th, 1992. Although, being that the studio had no faith in it, they released it in a grand total of 8 theaters. To get it on home video, they sold it as a package deal with the Terminator. The rights to the film were sold and resold numerous times over the years. After being shuffled around, it finally ended up back at MGM. In 2016, the company Kino Lorber was able to get the original negatives and did a remaster for Blu-ray. Highway to Hell is a lot of fun. It does a great job with the material. It takes itself just seriously enough, but doesn't go overboard on the humor. It's a tricky balancing act that they managed to pull off. How can you not love a movie where we finally find out what happened to Jimmy Hoffa?
Office? Nah, Jimmy ain't here.
It's a very entertaining film, and an absolute shame that due to problems outside of the creative team's control, the film was essentially buried. While I don't think it would have ever been a blockbuster, it certainly would have done better than it was allowed, and more people would have seen it. De Jong knew his film was going to be for a niche audience, and he's happy with how it turned out. He's still somewhat bothered by the changes Daly made, but he begrudgingly admitted the producer was at least partially right. The director worked hard to make a horror film with comedy, and not a parody of horror films. He loved the idea of hell being just like Earth, only slightly askew. Everything is familiar, and yet not normal. De Jong said this was the most difficult movie he worked on in his career up to this point. However, it was still a dream come true for a European filmmaker to do an American film. Helgeland continued writing, and went on to adapt the James Ellroy novel L.A. Confidential, which got him an Oscar for Best Writing. Johnson said that while Highway to Hell wasn't your standard horror film, that didn't make it easier, but definitely made it more fun. Although he later said that working for months on a low-budget film in the middle of the desert wasn't all that great. That Route 666 movie also got made, but not until much later in 2001. Also, while Ben Stiller did go on to much greater things, his ad-libs for the movie were indeed trash.
Who needs mesquite when you've got concrete?
Please tell me how to get out of here.
I don't know. But I do know that this steak has your name on it. What? Is it that you're a vegetarian? Because I'm telling you, it tastes very similar to chicken.
I'm not Hitler!
We've heard that story before, haven't we?
Once it's explained, the devil will look at me and I say goodbye, devil, and he goes goodbye, Bob.